Hello. So in this edition of Writing Notes, we're going to talk about attributing quotations in MLA format in 8th edition MLA, which came out in 2016. So on this side of the screen, the left-hand side of the screen, I've got a sample works cited page here. And this is just a set of sources chosen from a paper that I've been working on recently. And we've got some different types of sources here, and that's going to give us some different information about attributing sources effectively. What we're going to see is different ways of setting up MLA in-text citations and making sure that you're attributing quotes correctly. So on this sort of brief works cited page, we've got a book, Kwame Anthony Appiah's Cosmopolitanism. We've got an article from a library database, Drusilla Cornell and Karen von Marl's Ubuntu Feminism. We've got two articles by the same author, Chilezona Etze. We got Empathetic Cosmopolitan and Transcultural Affinity. Again, these are both library databases. And then we've got a YouTube video, the interview with the Nwoku Cultural Group. So we're going to talk about how to cite these different sources and how to attribute quotes properly. Now, on this side, I've got a bunch of examples of quotes with citations and with attribution, and I'm going to take you through some of the different approaches you can use. Now, before I do that, I want to sort of distinguish between citing and attributing. So, an attribution is something generally in the sentence itself, in the sentence that you're writing, that tells us where this information comes from, whether this is a quotation, a paraphrase, statistic, historical data, a fact, a principle of science, or politics, psychology, sociology, whatever it is. Where is this information coming from? That's what we call an attribution. A citation tells us where, or gives us the specific location within a source. Now, there are some instances in which you're not going to do an attribution, and a very few instances in which your citation is going to be very broad. So we'll talk about some of those things. So the first example here I want to show you, this includes a parenthetical citation, which is what we do in MLA, to Appiah's book. So this is probably the most basic type of citation. In this case, we've got my sentence, so I've got a little bit of framing here, but most of this sentence is the quotation from Appiah. So one thing you do always want to avoid is what we call a floating quote. And a floating quote is when an entire sentence in your paper is made up of somebody else's words. You always want some sort of framework to put this in your own sentence, even if it's something as simple as what I've done here. Just the first word, cosmopolitans, and then into the quote. I'll give you a couple of other ways of doing this as well, some that maybe are a little more versatile. But because I haven't named Appiah in this sentence, in the parenthetical citation, just at the end of the sentence, I'm going to put his last name and then the page number where this quotation comes from. So in this case, that's XV, page 25, or sorry, page 15 in the preface or the introduction of the book. And that's enclosed in quotation marks at the end of the sentence, and then and then the period at the end of the sentence, or the question mark or whatever it is that comes at the end of the sentence goes outside the parentheses. So that's a basic, fundamental parenthetical citation. Now, the other very common thing that you get with MLA citations is an attribution with a parenthetical citation. So in this quote, which I've taken from Cornell and Van Marl's article, I start by listing them. I start by including their names. As Drusilla Cornell and Karen von Marl put it, quote. So that's what we call an attribution. So that's me in the sentence telling readers what source this comes from. Then, because this source has pages, because it has a page range, I still need to include a parenthetical citation at the end, in this case just citing the page number. So if the author's last name or last names are listed in the sentence itself, they don't need to go in the parenthetical citation. If the sentence doesn't list the author's last name, it needs to go in the parentheses. So that's the those are the two sort of basic approaches. Either a full parenthetical citation with the author's last name and the page number, or attribution in your sentence, and then a parenthetical with the page number. One thing I do want to very quickly mention is that in 8th edition MLA, if you have, and I think this is accurate, if you have 3 or more authors, rather than listing all 3 of their names, what you would do is list the primary author and then the term et al. Et space al period. And that comes from the Latin. It basically means and the rest. So if you have 3 or more authors, that's what you would list rather than writing out all of the names of the authors. And a lot of times in the sciences, both the hard sciences and the social sciences, you will have sources that have 4, 5, 6, 12 authors. So that's what you want to do. Another brief note about listing authors' names is that the first time you list an author's name, you should list first name and last name, but then after that, you should just refer to them by their last name. So that's the standard here. Okay, if we move on to this next sentence here, this is coming from Cielazione Etze. In this case, I've actually incorporated paraphrases from 2 of his articles. Now, again, I've got 2 articles listed here, so if you're using multiple sources by the same author, what you want to do in the parenthetical citation is give a title keyword. So in this case, empathetic cosmopolitanism and transcultural affinity are my 2 title keywords. And they're listed in quotation marks to indicate that they're title keywords, and then again followed by the page numbers. So the reason that you want to do this is because fundamentally what these citations are meant to do is to point you back to the source on the works cited page. So when we have this citation to Appia, we know that that corresponds to this works cited entry here. When we have Cornell and Van Marl here, we know it corresponds to Cornell and Van Marl here. But in this case, we have 2 sources by Etze. And so what we need is another marker, in this case title keywords, to point us to which of these 2 essays is being cited. So the other thing to note here is that I'm not actually quoting Etze in this sentence. What I'm doing is paraphrasing or summarizing what he's done. And so that's another thing that you do want to be thinking about is citations don't just go with quotations, they also go with paraphrases especially, and sometimes with summaries. And I've got a video on quotation, summary, and paraphrase can give you some more information about that. Now, very quickly, I want to turn to this lengthy guy right here. So this is what we call a block quote. Now, block quote is something you do when you have a lengthy quotation. There are different guidelines that people use for this. I think of it as 4 or more lines of text should be set off as a block quote. Some people say 40 words or more, so it's up to you. Again, we've got an attribution here. We know this is coming from Appia. But then, rather than being in quotation marks, the block quote is going to be set off. So every line of it is going to be indented, starts on a new line, every line indented, no quotation marks. So that's one thing, that's one way in which a block quote is different from a regular quote run in with your text. I mean, it's also set off, so that's probably the big difference, but no quotation marks. And then the other formatting difference is that the period or question mark, exclamation mark, whatever it is, at the end of the quotation is going to be inside the parentheses. So the parenthetical citation comes at the end, after the period. And again, this is a regular parenthetical citation. We've got attribution here, we've got the page number here, but if this was coming from one of Etsy's essays, we'd be including transcultural affinity or empathetic cosmopolitanism, whatever it is. So the last citation format I want to show you is this one. This comes from a YouTube video, an interview with the Woke Cultural Group, who are a really, really fascinating musical and cultural preservation group from South Africa. What we have here is a source without pages. So, I mean, if you look at the citation, it's clearly a YouTube video, but the same principle here is going to apply for things like news articles, magazine articles, or things like this that don't have pages listed, websites, etc., etc. So in this case, we do have an attribution in an interview with the cultural group, but it's not a clear enough attribution that it would directly point us back to this source. And so what we've got is a title keyword. So again, like the two sources by Etsy, we've got a keyword that directs us back to the Works Cited page, so we can figure out where exactly this information is coming from. Now, in terms of a source like this where we don't have page numbers, if it's a video, sometimes people will want a timestamp, which basically means where in the video this occurs, what minute, second, hour, if it's a movie or something like this. Especially with short videos, like most of what's on YouTube, that's not necessarily that crucial. And so I haven't done it here, but in places, for instance, where I've cited movies, I actually have done those. So that's something to keep in mind, is how difficult is this going to be for your reader to find. Then the other type of source without page numbers usually is something like a newspaper or a magazine article. And sometimes people will tell you to number the paragraphs and write para 3 or whatever it is, if it's the third paragraph. For my money, unless the source already numbers its paragraphs, I'm not going to go in and count 15 paragraphs or something like that to check whether you've got a correct citation. So for me, if the source doesn't include page numbers, I wouldn't even bother with it. So again, that's the sort of basics of MLA, citations, and attributions. The key things that you want to make sure you're doing to get the author's name or names in there. there, and then the page number where that information can be found if it's a source with pages.